He ran the streets like royalty. But the moment he went behind bars, the very crew that once worshipped him started turning their backs. From the outside, John Gotti appeared untouchable, the Teflon Don, who beat every case against him. But behind the designer suits and tabloid fame lay a brutal truth. In the world of organized crime, no throne is ever secure. What happens when America's most famous gangster suddenly finds himself isolated in the nation's harshest prison? Did the Gambino crime family, once the most powerful criminal organization in America, truly abandon their leader? And what became of his legacy after his body was lowered into the ground? Tonight, we explore how the federal government systematically dismantled John Gotti's empire, why he faced such unprecedented harsh treatment in prison, and the bitter betrayals that ultimately defined his final years. In the criminal underworld of 1970s New York, John Gotti was building a reputation that would eventually make him a household name, but not yet for the tailored suits and media soundbites that would later define him. Instead, he earned his stripes through a much more direct approach, taking what he wanted at gunpoint. John was a guy who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, explains former FBI agent Joseph Cantamessa. Unlike some of the old-timers who were moving away from street violence, Gotti embraced it. He saw it as currency in his world. This philosophy was perfectly demonstrated in December 1972, when Gotti orchestrated one of the most audacious heists of the era, the JFK airport hijacking. The operation targeted valuable cargo shipments passing through the airport's freight terminals. While other Mafia figures preferred more subtle schemes, Gotti's approach was bold and direct. They took whatever wasn't nailed down, explains crime historian Alexander Romano. Electronics, clothing, jewelry. If it had value, Gotti's crew was lifting it. They were netting millions yearly from these operations. But these hijackings weren't just about money. They were establishing Gotti as someone who could deliver, a rising star in the Gambino family hierarchy who wasn't afraid to challenge the old ways of doing business. By the early 1980s, the Gambino crime family was under the leadership of Paul Castellano, a boss who preferred legitimate business dealings over street rackets. Tall, imposing, and distant, Castellano operated from his mansion on Staten Island, nicknamed the White House, a fitting symbol of how disconnected he had become from the streets where Gotti thrived. Paul Castellano represented the old guard, explains former prosecutor John Gleason. He wanted the family to focus on construction, unions, waste management, businesses where they could hide their criminality behind legitimate fronts. He saw the street stuff, the hijackings, the gambling as high-risk, low-reward activities. This fundamental disagreement created the first cracks in what would become a fatal rupture. Castellano demanded a hefty cut from Gotti's airport operations, while providing little protection or support in return. Former Gambino associate Michael Romano explains, "In the life, respect flows both ways. The boss takes his cut, but he's supposed to take care of his people too." Paulie wasn't holding up his end in the eyes of guys like John. The tension escalated when rumors began circulating that Gotti was involved in heroin trafficking, a business explicitly forbidden by Castellano after the high-profile Pizza Connection case had brought unwanted attention to the Mafia's drug operations. Castellano had one major rule: no drugs, says retired DEA agent Robert Gagny. Not because he had moral objections, but because drug cases carried heavy sentences, and defendants were more likely to cooperate with authorities to reduce those sentences. It was bad for business. Whether Gotti was truly involved in narcotics remains disputed to this day, but the suspicion alone was enough to deepen the growing rift between the ambitious capo and his increasingly distant boss. The breaking point came in 1983 when federal agents arrested Gotti's brother Gene and close friend Angelo Ruggiero on heroin trafficking charges. Worse still, the government had obtained damning wiretap evidence from Ruggiero's home phone, recordings that not only implicated the defendants, but captured them speaking disrespectfully about Castellano himself. Former FBI supervisor Bruce Maurer recalls, "Those tapes were dynamite." Ruggiero and others were openly mocking Castellano, calling him greedy, questioning his leadership. In their world, that kind of disrespect can get you killed. Castellano demanded the tapes, ostensibly to prepare his legal defense against any potential charges that might emerge from them. But Gotti and Ruggiero understood the real reason. Castellano wanted to hear who had been disloyal, who had insulted him, who was potentially dealing drugs against his orders. It was basically a death warrant, explains former NYPD Detective Joseph Coffey. If Castellano heard those tapes, multiple people would end up dead, including potentially Gotti himself. When Ruggiero refused to turn over the tapes, Castellano moved to dissolve Gotti's crew, effectively demoting him within the family structure and cutting off his primary source of income. For an ambitious man like John Gotti, this wasn't just a financial threat, it was an existential one. If he couldn't protect his own crew, his reputation on the streets would be irreparably damaged. Something had to be done. In the shadows of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, Gotti began assembling what would become known as the Fist, a coalition of like-minded mobsters who shared his frustration with Castellano's leadership. Key among them was Frank DeCicco, a respected captain who could help legitimize any move against the boss, and Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, a feared enforcer whose support would prove crucial. This wasn't something Gotti could do alone, explains former FBI informant Dominic Montilio. Taking out a boss requires support from within the family and tacit approval from the other New York families. Otherwise, it's suicide. Carefully, methodically, Gotti began reaching out to younger members of other Mafia families who shared his more aggressive vision for the future of Cosa Nostra. The old guard was aging out, and a new generation was ready to take control, a generation that saw John Gotti as their natural leader. As tensions built throughout 1985, a final catalyst emerged that would set Gotti's plan in motion. On December 2nd, Aniello Delacroce, Gotti's mentor and the family underboss who had often mediated between him and Castellano, died of cancer at age 71. Delacroce was the buffer, explains Mafia historian Thomas Repetto. He was old school, respected by everyone, and he kept Gotti in check while also ensuring Castellano didn't go too far in punishing John's crew. With him gone, there was no one left to prevent an all-out war. In what many viewed as the ultimate sign of disrespect, Castellano failed to attend Delacroce's wake, a glaring breach of Mafia protocol that infuriated Gotti and others who had been close to the underboss. Days later, information reached Gotti that sealed Castellano's fate. The boss was planning a major reorganization of the family structure that would further marginalize Gotti and his allies. The message was clear: act now or be destroyed. The opportunity presented itself through Frank DeCicco, who informed Gotti that Castellano had scheduled a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan for December 16, 1985. It would be a public location, with limited security, a rare vulnerability for a man who typically moved with extreme caution. The plan was brutally simple, says former Detective Coffey. Hit him before he could hit them. Do it publicly, dramatically, in a way that sent a message not just to the Gambino family, but to all 5 families that a new era had begun. As dusk fell on that cold December evening, Paul Castellano's black Lincoln Continental pulled up outside Sparks Steakhouse. At his side was driver and bodyguard Thomas Bellotti. Neither man would make it inside for dinner. From a car parked across the street, John Gotti and Sammy Gravano watched as 4 men in long coats and Russian fur hats approached the vehicle. Seconds later, gunshots echoed through the Manhattan street as both Castellano and Bellotti were shot multiple times at point-blank range. The shooters disappeared into waiting vehicles, while Gotti's car calmly pulled away from the scene. It was the most public mob hit in decades, explains Prosecutor Gleason. Right in the heart of Manhattan, during the Christmas season, with potential witnesses everywhere. It wasn't just an assassination, it was a coronation. In the chaotic aftermath, a temporary ruling committee was established to manage family affairs, but the truth was evident to everyone. John Gotti had seized control of the Gambino crime family through violence, just as countless mob bosses had done before him. On January 15, 1986, it became official. John Gotti, the 45-year-old gangster from the streets of Queens, was now the most powerful Mafia boss in America. The king had claimed his throne. But as history would soon prove, wearing the crown meant painting a target on his back. For a man who once commanded an empire from the finest restaurants in Manhattan, John Gotti's new domain was a concrete box measuring just 6 feet by 9. The dapper Don had fallen, and the federal government was determined to ensure he would never rise again. They didn't just want to imprison John Gotti, explains former defense attorney Bruce Cutler. They wanted to bury him alive. Within hours of his 1992 conviction, Gotti was transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, a facility nicknamed the Roach Motel by inmates and guards alike. But unlike other high-profile prisoners, Gotti wouldn't be granted the relative freedom of general population. Instead, he was immediately placed in administrative detention, a bureaucratic term for what amounted to solitary confinement. The government made a calculation, says former prosecutor Andrew Maloney. Gotti had such extraordinary charisma and leadership abilities that they believed he could effectively run criminal operations from inside prison walls if given any opportunity to communicate with other inmates. For 23 hours each day, Gotti remained alone in his cell, with only 1 hour allocated for recreation, typically conducted on the prison's rooftop in whatever weather conditions happened to prevail that day. In winter, temperatures on that rooftop could drop below freezing, recalls former prison guard Thomas Morelli. Most inmates would refuse to go up there. But Gotti? He'd go every day, pacing back and forth in a heavy coat, refusing to show any sign of weakness. The isolation wasn't just physical. Gotti was permitted only one 10-minute phone call per day, barely enough time to speak with his attorneys, let alone maintain contact with family or associates. Newspapers arrived with articles about organized crime mysteriously cut out. Television access was severely restricted, and visits from family members were conducted through thick glass barriers. They created a psychological torture chamber, argues criminal justice reform advocate Elena Santorini. Whatever you think about Gotti's crimes, this kind of treatment raises serious constitutional questions about cruel and unusual punishment. Gotti's legal team launched multiple challenges against these conditions, arguing that they violated his constitutional rights and severely hampered his ability to participate in his own legal defense. The government's response was consistent. This wasn't punishment, it was prevention. The Bureau of Prisons classified Gotti as a special security risk, explains former federal prosecutor Michael Chertoff. They maintained that his extraordinary influence within the criminal underworld justified extraordinary measures to contain him. In court hearings, government attorneys painted a dire picture of what might happen if Gotti were allowed into general population: corrupted guards, intimidated witnesses, and the potential reorganization of criminal enterprises from behind bars. The courts largely agreed, and Gotti's isolation continued. Daily life in the Roach Motel took a predictable toll. The man who once commanded attention wherever he went now found himself invisible to all but a handful of guards and occasional visitors. Meals were delivered through a slot in the door. Exercise consisted of walking in circles in a space barely larger than a boxing ring. Even showers were taken alone, under supervision. The nickname Roach Motel wasn't just about the insects, says former inmate Raymond Gonzalez, who served time at MCC during Gotti's incarceration. It was because once you checked in, you didn't check out, especially if you were in admin detention. The isolation could break even the strongest minds. For a man whose power had been built on personal connections, fear, and respect, this isolation represented something far worse than physical confinement. It was the systematic dismantling of everything that had made John Gotti who he was. The government strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, observes criminologist Dr. Elena Vasquez. They understood that Gotti's power came from his ability to communicate, to inspire loyalty, to project strength. By cutting him off from human contact, they weren't just imprisoning his body, they were imprisoning his influence. Former FBI agent Joseph Pistone, who infiltrated the Bonanno family as Donnie Brasco in the 1970s, puts it more bluntly. In the mob, out of sight means out of mind. Once Gotti disappeared behind those walls, his power began evaporating. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the criminal underworld is no different. As the years passed, reports began to emerge of Gotti's deteriorating emotional state. The legendary coolness under pressure that had defined his public persona gave way to outbursts of frustration. The calculating criminal mastermind, who had once outsmarted federal prosecutors 3 times in succession, now found himself unable to control even the most basic aspects of his daily existence. Prison doesn't just confine you physically, explains Dr. Catherine Forrest, a psychologist specializing in long-term isolation effects. It restructures your identity. For someone like Gotti, whose entire self-concept was built around power and control, this loss of agency would have been particularly devastating. In 1998, 6 years into his sentence, Gotti faced a new enemy, one that couldn't be intimidated or bribed: throat cancer. He was transferred to the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, for treatment. For a brief period, the isolation eased as medical necessity trumped security concerns. But following treatment, Gotti was returned to solitary confinement, now physically weakened, as well as isolated. The cancer returned with a vengeance in 2002. This time, there would be no recovery. On June 10, 2002, at the age of 61, John Gotti died in prison, abandoned by the criminal empire he had once ruled with an iron fist. Even in death, the government's campaign to diminish Gotti's legacy continued. His funeral was held at a non-religious venue rather than a church, and conspicuously absent were representatives from other New York crime families, a telling sign of how completely Gotti's influence had evaporated. In the old days, a boss's funeral would have been attended by delegates from every family, explains organized crime historian Alexander Romano. Their absence spoke volumes about how far Gotti had fallen in the criminal hierarchy. With Gotti gone, the once mighty Gambino family entered a period of decline and fragmentation. His son, John A. Gotti, attempted to take the reins, but he lacked his father's charisma, strategic thinking, and, perhaps most importantly, the fear factor that had kept potential rivals in line. Junior was respected because of his name, not because of what he had done or could do, says former NYPD organized crime detective Joseph Coffey. In that world, respect based on bloodline only gets you so far. Despite multiple federal prosecutions resulting in 4 hung juries, the younger Gotti never consolidated control over the family. By his own admission, he eventually walked away from organized crime, leaving a power vacuum that further destabilized what had once been America's most powerful criminal organization. In the years following Gotti's death, the Gambino family continued to operate, but with diminished influence and cohesion. Leadership passed through several hands, with none able to recreate the fearsome reputation the family had enjoyed under Gotti's rule. The most dramatic evidence of this decline came in March 2019, when reputed Gambino boss Francesco "Frankie Boy" Cali was gunned down outside his Staten Island home, the first assassination of a New York crime family boss since Paul Castellano's murder outside Sparks Steakhouse more than 3 decades earlier. Even more telling was the motive, not a calculated power play or family rivalry, but a personal dispute allegedly sparked by a young man's belief that Cali had interfered with his romantic interest in the boss's niece. The assassination that had once required months of planning and family approval had been reduced to what amounted to a crime of passion. In the wake of Cali's death, Lorenzo Menino reportedly stepped in to guide the family's operations. But the Gambinos of today bear little resemblance to the criminal juggernaut that once controlled vast swaths of New York's economy. They're still involved in the traditional rackets, says FBI organized crime supervisor Thomas Brogan. Sports betting, loan sharking, construction fraud. But the scale is different. They're no longer the shadow government they once were. Recent years have seen multiple law enforcement operations targeting what remains of the family. In July 2019, a joint FBI-Italian police operation led to the arrest of Thomas Gambino, son of the late Carlo Gambino, along with 17 others. 6 months later, a major sweep across the Bronx and Westchester resulted in more arrests. In November 2020, 16 alleged Gambino associates were charged in connection with schemes involving the garbage industry and union tampering. And as recently as June 2024, authorities disrupted a $22.7 million illegal sports betting operation linked to the family. But are the Gambinos truly finished? or merely adapting to a new era of criminal enterprise. Some law enforcement officials believe the family is simply biding its time, maintaining a lower profile, while exploring new criminal ventures that attract less attention than the headline-grabbing activities of the Gotti era. Organized crime evolves, explains former prosecutor John Gleason. The smart ones learn to operate in the shadows again, away from the cameras and publicity that ultimately brought down John Gotti. From the streets of Queens to the pinnacle of criminal power, and finally to a lonely death in federal custody, John Gotti's story remains a cautionary tale about the ultimate price of criminal ambition. The man who once commanded an empire worth an estimated $500 million annually spent his final years in a concrete box, isolated and forgotten by the very organization he had once ruled. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the Dapper Don comes from his former underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, whose testimony sealed Gotti's fate. John wanted to be famous. He got what he wanted, and it destroyed him. Was John Gotti broken by prison, or did he die fighting the system until his last breath? Drop a pizza emoji pizza in the comments, and let us know your thoughts on the rise and fall of America's most notorious gangster. For more exclusive stories that take you deep inside the secret world of Mafia Titans, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Our next documentary, Inside John Gotti's Life in Solitary Confinement, will provide even more shocking details about the psychological warfare waged against the former Gambino boss. This is Secret World of Mafia Titans, where we uncover the true stories behind the headlines, one boss at a time.